everybody, could you please take your seats? Please take your seats. Could everyone take their seats, please? Thank you. Can everyone take their seats and we'll start right away. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see so many familiar, beautiful faces tonight. It's like a little reunion. It's wonderful to be a part of this. Welcome to the book launch of Moments in Time, sermons from the United Church of Canada from 1910 to 2020. And it just so happens that UCC is celebrating the centenary, so this is very apropos. I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Religion and its Contexts. The Center, through academic and continuing education events, we share its distinctive contextual approach to the study of religion in all aspects: theology and belief, historical development, lived experience, and diversity of expressions in the United Church of Canada and in other Christian contexts, as well as Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and other religious understandings. So a warm welcome to all of you joining us here, and also to all of you joining us online. I'd like to start the evening off with a land acknowledgement. As we gather together today, we acknowledge and respect the sacred land on which Victoria University operates. It has been a site of human activity for thousands of years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are encouraged to continually strengthen our relationships among all living beings and with this land. And now I'd like to hand the reins over to Professor Henry Hsu. Henry Hsu is a Hsu De, Assistant Professor in Chinese Buddhist Studies. And he also is the Director of the Center for Religion and its Contexts. Please let me welcome Professor Hsu.
Good evening. I'm Henry Hsu. It is truly an honor for me to be here with you as we celebrate the launch of this remarkable book. I have the privilege to receive an early copy of this book That is actually my copy, so don't take mine away. I must say that I was profoundly moved by so many aspects of this book. Um, the way this volume captures a century of history through its carefully selected sermons, written originally in English, Japanese, and Korean, is both inspiring and invaluable. It is amazing how these sermons offer us a unique glimpse into the evolving landscapes of faith and human experience, and also serve as a tool for reflection and growth. This truly serves as an exemplary practice for other traditions. As many of you know, my area of research is in Buddhist studies, and I come from a Buddhist background. And I cannot help but think that, I really wish that something like this could be found in the Buddhism, the Buddhist traditions in Canada, which also has a history of just over a century. It's what is amazing about the book is that it offers us a unique glimpse into the century of human challenges as seen through the sermons that responded to and addressed them. This book not only explains the careful criteria behind the selection of each sermon, but I think more importantly, it offers us insight and analysis into the homiletics excellence and historical and theological significance each sermon holds. Thank you, both authors, for bringing us this extraordinary work. My time at Emmanuel College over these 5 years or so has been truly transformative. And thanks really to the ecumenical heritage, the deep ecumenical roots of the United Church of Canada. It has not only deepened my own spiritual practice, but also opened my eyes to the rich wisdom within other faith traditions as well. And it's not just the spiritual part of influence, but also the way that something like the sermons was meticulously recorded, documented, and studied and analyzed. This is something that I think other traditions can learn from. So it is my pleasure to introduce the authors and the respondent for this evening. First, we have Professor Hee-Ran Kim Craig, the current principal of Emmanuel College, who likely needs no introduction within these walls. However, I would like to take a moment to highlight her areas of research. Professor Kim Craig's work exemplifies a deep commitment to interdisciplinary approaches to practical theology, particularly in homiletics. Her teaching and research explore a range of topics, from biblical interpretation and post-colonial theory to feminist homiletics, liturgy, migration, and decolonizing practices, as well as connecting the climate crisis with preaching. And next, I'm honored to introduce Professor Don Schweitzer. I had the privilege of meeting him for the first time just before we started. Dr. Schweitzer was ordained in the United Church of Canada in 1982. He is Professor Emeritus at St. Andrew's College in Saskatoon, where he held the McDougall Professorship of Theology from year 2000. His research and teaching interests encompass a wide array of theological topics, including Christology, resurrection of Jesus, pneumatology, and the doctrine of God. Additionally, he has a profound interest in the history and theology of the United Church of Canada, as well as the themes of grace and shared identity. And finally, we also welcome Reverend Dr. John Young, who is the respondent this evening. Reverend Young was ordained by the United Church's Maritime Conference in 1978. After serving in various congregational ministries, he joined the faculty at Queen's Theological College, where he taught history of Christianity and pastoral studies until 2016, and served as head of theological studies from 2011 to 2015. Since 2016, Reverend Dr. Young has held the role of Executive Minister Theological Leadership at the United Church's General Council Office, and he has been an active member of Emmanuel College Advisory Committee. And from 2021 and 22, he also served as interim principal at Emmanuel College. And I was working with him, in that year. So thank you so much, Reverend Young. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kim Craig and Professor John Schweitzer and Reverend Young. Thank you. So may I, please, Don, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with everybody tonight, and I thank all of you for coming. But most of all, I want to thank Haran for inviting me to work with her on this book. It was her idea, and she's always great to work with. Many people, if you read the acknowledgement section, it's kind of long. Many people are to be thanked for helping us produce this book. I'd like to mention only a few right now. Marguerite Van Dee, John Young, and Harold Wells read first drafts of the chapters and offered us important feedback on them. It's a better book because of them. And also Hannah and David Kim Craig did crucial translation work for us. Now, in terms of the history of the United Church, the sermons collected in this book, I think, provide concrete examples of how preachers in the United Church or its predecessors understood their time and place and the calling of the church within it. For studying or teaching the history of the United Church of Canada, I think this book will be a useful supplement for something like Phyllis Earhart's A Church with the Soul of the Nation. Phyllis's book gives a great overview of the United Church's history and lots of detailed information and insightful analysis. And this book can be a supplement to that with its concrete examples of how United Church clergy and others understood and evaluated their historical moment and how they tried to direct people in the midst of it. For instance, Chown's sermon in chapter 1 on why he favored church union is a very important document for the history of union. And the sermons by Stan Lusick and Bev Brazier in chapter 8 give a glimpse of the United Church in the 1980s, first as it's heading towards General Council in 1988, and then afterwards trying to come to terms with the momentous decision made there about the eligibility of sexual minorities for commissioning and ordination, as well as other changes in the church. So the sermons gathered in this book are important artifacts from the history of the United Church, and they help track how that history unfolded. Theologically, these sermons, I think, are important statements of applied theology or developing theology in the United Church. They don't rank with the subordinate standards or with reports approved by General Council, but they show how Jesus, the Church, Canadian society, and major international events were understood at different points in the United Church's history. And they also help track how the theologies operative in the United Church have changed or remained the same over the years.
Great to be here. Thank you. So let me also express my big thanks to Dawn, who said yes to this little bit daunting idea more than 6 years ago. So think about 6 years ago. We had a pandemic, and it was almost impossible to go to the archives for several months. And then I moved from Saskatoon to Emmanuel, and then became the principal. And then most of all, he retired. And all those things happened all those years. And yet it was Dawn who were anchoring me and keep doing this work together. So without you, I don't think the book would have been here. So thank you. I also want to acknowledge all who are willingly sharing their very precious sermons and cheering us on. But especially those who are here today. I hope that the online is working. Sean, is that working? Great, because there are many people that I know who couldn't be here but wanting to be here still. So thank you. So I'll go with the real kind of honor. The very Reverend Dr. Bruce McLeod, the very Reverend Stan Lush, and the Reverend Dr. Catherine McLean, who came all the way from Edmonton today to be here. The Reverend Dr. John Wyatt, and the Reverend Bab Brazier, and the many others. These are 28 sermons, and these are wonderful folks who are so generously donating their sermons for us to work with. So it's a real joy to be here today and speaking a little bit about 28 sermons in 3 minutes. To survey more than 100 years of the United Church of Canada preaching, it is a daunting task. Don and I went through, I don't know how many sermons, to select 2 or 3 from each decade. But there were also gaps, so we had to go searching in some other ways for sermons that were very hard to find. So in some ways, this book is incomplete, not at all perfect. There was much that was left out. There was much that otherwise remained undiscovered. So with those limits in mind, it is fair to say that these sermons do show a very multifaceted, diverse, biblically rooted, and theologically sound preaching ministry that is distinct legacy of the United Church of Canada. You will find like a typical 3-point sermon, and you will find creative, imaginative ways of preaching in many of these sermons. You will find narrative style preaching as well as doctrinal, expository sermons. You'll find effective sermon illustrations and powerful use of the rhetorical device for preaching. You'll find much more that I didn't even name here. You will find critical themes and social issues that are still very relevant today in most sermons. Most of all, you will find that every sermon tries to be faithful to the gospel, proclaiming God, the good news of Jesus Christ, and God's peace and justice, mercy and love for the world. So let me conclude my brief remarks with a story that is in the introduction. You'll have, if you have any doubt that preaching moves people, or if you have a question that if actually sermon can make an impact on our theology, our lives, our practices, this story may tell otherwise. Dr. David Holman preached at Eglinton United Church in Toronto on the topic of the ecological problem. Virginia Mills, a member sitting in the pew on that Sunday, heard the message and asked herself, if care of the earth is that central for our faith, why is there no mention of this in our creed? Holman's message and Mill's curiosity led to a process whereby the United Church's new creed was changed to include the line, to live with respect in creation. In the 35th General Council, 1994, exactly 30 years ago. Many people and levels of church polity played incredible roles in this addition to a new creed. The process by which this happened was begun by one person's preaching and another person's response to it. Thank you.
I'm delighted and honored to have been asked to speak today at this book launch for Haran Kim Craig's and Don Schweitzer's work. And in some ways, in the spirit of a sermon, I'm going to do 4 things, not 3, but 4. I'll start just with a few comments about what I think is the significance of this book at this point in time in our history as a denomination as we come to our 100th anniversary. And then I'll provide a very brief review of the book in terms of its content. And then I want to talk about the contributions the book makes, because I think they're significant contributions, not only to an understanding of our history, but also to those of us who preach within the denomination. And then finally, I'll talk in a little bit greater detail about the sermons in one of the chapters. We are in the midst of the United Church's centennial year, and moments in time, so aptly named, provide deep insight into moments in our history, moments that were lived out in congregations small and large. Worship, of course, in the denomination, and preaching more specifically, is where in our tradition nurture, formation, and commitment get honed week by week. It's where comfort is experienced, and in fact, commitment renewed for the living of these days. And in this book, we see how it is that preachers in different periods in the last really 110 years, a little more than that, in fact, see how it was that they read the context of their day and then considered what Scripture had to say to those particular issues and questions that were around amongst those who served. And in that sense, this book is, I think, a key contribution to our centennial year in the picture that it gives us in different decades. But I think it's significant now for another reason. Both Haran and Don have spent much of their careers as theological educators. And you know, when we think about theological education, we think about what happens here, okay, in places like this. But what this book reminds us is that the faculty of our schools represent a significant resource in the wider life of the church, through workshops that they do at regional events, and in the writing that they do, the presentations they make to congregations. Moments in Time is such a work, and its presence speaks to the place that theological schools and their faculty have in the denomination's ecosystem. So let me offer a brief overview of the book. It starts with an introduction that is, in fact, speaks so well to the place of preaching and something of the history of it within the denomination, and at least history in terms of how it's been taught. And then we have, for each decade from 1910 through 2020, we have either 2 or 3 sermons, as Haran said, from that period. Always with a brief sketch of the preacher, and perhaps most valuably, after each sermon, assessments of it from the perspective of homiletical excellence and historical and theological significance. The book also is extensively researched in relation to what was happening in the church and in the world, and into the events and the personages and the illustrations that each preacher uses. I mean, that's a lot of research. And the testimony to it is, at the end of every chapter, there are footnotes that run for each chapter between 50 and 100. The preachers whose sermons Haran and Don selected served in rural churches, small town churches, suburban ones, large city congregations, and for me, most notably, in 1943, a community of Japanese Canadian United Church members in Kelso, BC, who had been interned there. Some of these preachers spent a significant portion of their time teaching part-time or full-time. Sermons from both men and women, and likewise sermons from ministers who represent something of the denomination's ethnic diversity. Preaching from members of the Indigenous United Church community are also found. So in that sense, it's a book that represents a good cross-section of an insight into who we once were and whom we've become. My comments already, I think, have given a hint about what I think are several of the particular contributions the book makes, but I want to name some of those specifically. You cannot read this book and miss the importance of context, of attention to one's context when you preach. And it's something critical. In my days at Queen's, I used to teach a course from time to time in worship. And I would remind my students that there were 2 C words they always needed to keep in mind: context and common sense. And they needed to do that in the worship service, but also in the sermons they delivered. And the importance of context here shines through in the sermons that the authors have chosen, and in their reflections about homiletical excellence, historical and theological significance. They give attention, Don and Haran, to the context of the preacher and how that context factors into the sermon. As a contemporary preacher, and I can put myself in that category as I finish 19 and a half months as a retired supply at Bridge Street United Church in Belleville. As a contemporary preacher, you're reminded of the importance of context again and again as you read it. Another key contribution is the exposure that you get in this book to different sermons and different preaching styles. Sermons, of course, are oral creations, meant to be heard, not to be read like an essay that you can start and then put down and pick up again. But nonetheless, one learns a lot from reading through the sermons of this book. And let me offer a personal illustration. Bruce McLeod's sermon in this book repeats at various key points a phrase from the gospel text he's using. It's a technique of repetition that brings the hearer of the sermon back to that central theme, that point, that overall point Bruce McLeod wanted to make with that sermon. He didn't invent that, but he uses it brilliantly in the sermon here. That same pattern of repeating a key phrase from the scripture text you're using is something I've done from time to time, and was aware I was doing it. But it was in reading McLeod's sermon, because I had an advanced copy like Henry, because of what I was going to do today. It was in reading that brought that technique back to my consciousness again. And in a sermon not so long ago at Bridge Street, I used it and got comment from it from people at the door. From the sermon by Richard Roberts, I was reminded that I need to preach more often from the Psalms than I tend to do. Reading through that assessment that Haran and Don make about homiletical excellence, theological and historical significance, provides a preacher who reads the book with examples of how to make their preaching more engaging and more effective. And finally, I want to talk about the sermons in one of the chapters. I must confess that as a Maritimer, I was so tempted to talk about the sermons that you find in the 1950s. And even more so because the sermons by the two individuals, the Reverend Lewis Murray and the Reverend Dr. Frank Archibald, were from people who were significant to me personally at several points in my time in ministry. Lou Murray was a member of the presbytery where I had my settlement charge. He played the organ at every presbytery meeting. But for me, he was that kind of avuncular figure who would at some point in a meeting, the break, come and see how I was doing, this rookie in a 4-point pastoral charge. Frank Archibald was the minister of a large United Church in Moncton, New Brunswick for 26 years. And when he retired from that in 1970, before this was a common thing to do, he thought it was good to get out of town, to let his successor have a chance to develop ministry in that church. So he went to Sackville United Church, where Mount Allison is located. That same fall, I went to Mount Allison to begin my undergrad degree. And listening to Frank Archibald preach week by week was a significant factor, not the only one, but a significant factor in my decision 2 years later to become a candidate for ministry. What I'm going to do is to talk at a little bit greater length about the 3 sermons we find in the chapter from the 1940s. First of those is one by the Reverend Nora Hughes that she preaches in 1940. She's among the first women to be ordained in the United Church. Her sermon is strongly biblical. She wrestles with Galatians 5, chapter 5, verse 1. In the concepts here that Paul uses in talking about freedom and bondage. As Haran and Don note in their analysis of her sermon, she represents the very best of historical critical thinking in that era. She studies in the mid to late 1930s. And when she studied, the New Testament, and especially the letters of Paul, carried greater importance for her and for the church more generally in her view, and in the view of scholars of the day, than did the Old Testament. She also believed, again, congruent with the approach to Scripture in mainline Protestant theological schools in the 1930s when she was a student. She believed in supersessionism, supersessionism, the superiority of Christianity to Judaism. We wouldn't expect, in fact, wouldn't preach that now, at least usually, although I have heard it. But in her case, when you read that sermon, it's a reminder that even good sermons, and hers is a very good sermon, sermons reflect their context. They reflect the time and the place in which they're delivered. And sometimes, of course, time makes ancient good uncouth, as that saying goes. It reminds me, as a preacher, that my words, my sermons, are equally time-bound. And should someone read some of my sermons a couple of generations from now, they might similarly say, "How could he have thought that?" I might add that at a Celebration of Ministries service I attended in the early 1980s, I heard a sermon that reflected that same supersessionalism that Hughes has in her sermon. The second sermon in that chapter is by Kosaburo Shimusu. He preaches it in 1943 in Kelso, British Columbia, to a community of Japanese United Church members, Japanese Canadian United Church members who had been interned there. When I was reading the book, I'll confess I hesitated to turn the page into that sermon. I did because I've been struck for some time, for many years now, by the massive injustice that that internment represented. And I had to force myself to read the chapter. I think next to, and second only to our treatment of the Indigenous population of this country, I think second only to that is what we have done to, what we did in that era to Canadians of Japanese descent. I wondered what a pastor could say to a people who'd been uprooted, had lost their possessions, and been so badly treated. It was a sermon that, in fact, did not dwell on the injustices suffered, but it sought instead to bring hope to those interned, a hope embedded in the future of their children. I found myself, not surprisingly, deeply moved by the pastoral, caring message of that sermon, especially in the face of the suffering that they had endured and that their minister was trying to address. And the final sermon in that chapter was written by the Reverend Dr. George Pidgeon, who served for decades at Bloor Street United Church here in Toronto. He preaches it just after at least the European phase of World War II had ended. Don and Haran note that it's about 30 minutes long. And when you read through, it's a long, long read. However, I was reminded, as I did that I received a letter a couple of years ago from the office of administrator of a church where I'd been asked to be a guest speaker. And in the letter, she told me that when I came, I was in no instance to preach for less than 22 minutes, and that if I went between 25 and 30, that would be preferable. So in our contemporary church, we still have long sermons. Pidgeon's sermon is especially interesting because of when he preaches it. Just after the end of the European theater, the war in the European theater. And he was at that time, you need to know, regarded as the United Church's finest preacher. He had a large radio audience. And his assessment of what the church was called to do in the immediate aftermath of the war is again a reminder and a testimony to the importance of preaching to the context of time and place. And he represents something of that transition from pre-war to what would be the whole development of the church, and the churches, in that age from kind of 45 through into the mid-60s, when many people went either to church or synagogue. Moments in Time is, I think, a superb book. It will please both the historian and the preacher, and it will provide the latter who reads it thoughtfully with insights about how to preach more effectively and more faithfully in our day and our time. And it's a massive contribution to our centennial and our need to understand the things that have shaped us, so we're clear what has led us to where we are now. Don, Haran, I don't know what else to say, but to say thank you. Thank you for this book. You've enriched us all through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Young, and thank you, Haran and Don. I was reading the book over the weekend, and in the words of Reverend Young, it is truly a superb book. I felt like I was holding the history of 100 years of the United Church in my hand, and it was surreal when I was told that some of the preachers who offer their sermons to this book project are here with us today in person and on Zoom. So I would like to invite them to share with us a few words about their sermons in no more than 2 minutes, I was told. But to begin with, I think we should hear the words of the very Reverend Bruce McLeod, who sent the words to Dawn. So please.
Yeah, originally Bruce planned to join us online, but isn't up to reading today, so sent us a text. So I'll read them. Yeah, I'll read his words for him. I was so thrilled the other day when my copy of Moments in Time arrived at the door. When Haran and Don first told me of their plan to use sermons from each decade as a lens on the church's emerging life, it was hard to picture. But now this beautifully produced realization of the dream, like a work of art finally emerging below the sculptor's chisel. Thank you for your dream, Haran and Don, and for the years of painstaking work that followed. My own studies in homiletics at New York's Union Seminary 75 years ago was the first ever approved there for a graduate program in practical theology. They gave it special attention and would have been so pleased to have such a rich resource as Moments in Time. But nothing like that was available. As a lifelong Sunday preacher, I am personally grateful for this groundbreaking recognition of the significance of an ancient craft, still practiced faithfully across the world by thousands, week by week, and still essential to the unfolding moments in time in the changing life of Jesus' church. Congratulations and gratitude from us all, Haran and Don. You have used your own moments to bless us all.
So may I invite others to, is that Catherine? Sorry, this is the first time that we meet. So yeah, thank you, Catherine.
Hello. Haran and Dawn, thank you. Thank you for the book, for the poignancy and the meaning and the power of the book. Thank you for honoring me by inviting me to offer you something to go in it. The art of preaching is always in community. It's always about relationship. We may dream in the middle of the night the best sermon we've ever had. We may wake up with terror about the words of the sermon falling off the pulpit into the floor. But we know that the reality of the sermon is what happens when we are in community. The sermon that I am privileged to have in this book took place in week 3 of pandemic. And the sermon is testimony to relationship within community. The board of St. Paul's United Church had met and guaranteed salaries to all the staff. The musicians, who had no choir to rehearse with, who had no need to go and practice piano and organ, who would not be showing up on Sunday mornings, said, "We then will use our professional time to learn the arts of film." And the board said, "We will purchase the software you need." This is about community life. But on week 3, Palm Sunday in 2020, I was out at the gate of my house. My daughter Hannah had a camera on what was then a very wobbly tripod. And I recorded a sermon that went to the congregation that weekend. I couldn't see them. I was looking at the phone, and it was all about relationship and community. I didn't know in week 3 how we would come to loathe the word pivot. But as I stood at the gate of my home and opened the gate and thought with my congregation about Jesus at the gate in Jerusalem, we learned how, as a community, to pivot. Thank you for bringing that farther beyond the places where I brought it.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and I really appreciate that you highlighted the word art. Preaching, I think, is really a form of art, and it is an art to teach art to others. And I think this it is what the book is serving us, a pedagogical tool to teach the art of preaching. Thank you so much. Joan, Sean, Joan is here.
We ran and Dawn. Am I on? Is this okay? Are we good?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, John. Thank you.
Okay. Ran and Dawn, thank you for a moment to speak about some of the moments that influenced my sermon that's included in your remarkable book. The congregation where I grew up in the 1940s and 50s had an outstanding Christmas pageant. I remember first as a young innkeeper's child, and later as the teenage Virgin Mary, anxiously waiting in the chancel in utter darkness. Then suddenly, there was a spotlight. I was in it, and I played my role. In the 1960s, standing at the sanctuary entrance of New York City's Riverside Church, I remember shivering barefoot in a mini sackcloth shift. I was nervously cuddling a tiny newborn. The organ suddenly stopped. I held tight, arms outstretched. I ran the long, cold marble aisle and breathlessly presented baby Jesus to Simeon and Anna in the chancel. These were liminal moments for me. Liminal moments when I found myself in God's story. At GST in the mid-1980s, feminist theologies provided new ways to make worship experiential and inclusive. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's permission to create apocryphal women's narratives to counter the androcentrism of biblical texts significantly influenced my sermon in Moments in Time. So too did serving a justice-seeking congregation. They welcomed experiential worship and preaching, and together we birthed many of them. For my moments over the time in the church, I'm incredibly grateful. And for this wonderful book of sermons and critical analyses that so many people have said all the right things about that I agree with. I would only add that this book will help readers experience God's 100 years story with the United Church of Canada and be able to find themselves in that story and in their history. Hey, Ran and Dawn, congratulations and thank you. Many will be grateful, as am I.
I'm assuming I'm on? Okay. Well, my name is Bev Brazier, and when I read, I'm the author of the sermon on Hannah, and it was written post 1988. And when I read it again, it had been a long time. I was right back there. At that time, I was serving the pastoral charge of New Richmond, Grand Cascapedi on the Gaspé Coast. And I was right back there. I was right back there. This sermon, it astonishes me that how anchored it is in time and place, that time and that place, because I can see the faces and I can smell how that sanctuary smells, and I could feel the feelings, and I knew the specific pastoral concerns that were in my head and my heart as I wrote it. And over again, I'm astonished and profoundly grateful for the word, how it's a living word, incarnate in bodies and communities. And so thankful for the gift and the calling of breaking open the word together with people, with congregations in every season of life, personally, and the life of the church. And whatever's going to happen in the world, and whatever's going to become of the church, the word is alive, and the gospel's not going anywhere. And it seems to me that it will be stories told and songs sung together, and the breaking open of the word, all of which by definition are relational and community creating, that it will be those things that sustain us and feed us for brave and faithful living of these days. So I thank you so much for the honor of being included in a group like this that blow my mind. But anyway, I'm very thankful, and for all of your work. What a gift in our 100th year. So thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you all. Do we have some time for questions from the floor? Anyone? Yeah, we need a microphone. Yeah. Or would you like to
Test.
come up?
Here we go. No, it's
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
It's
okay.
good. Hi, Richard. Hey, you can sit down.
Hi, thank you so much for the book. I've bought the book so I can explore this question on my own, but I'm curious because you had the opportunity to read so many sermons beyond those that were selected for the book, whether you want to comment on how Christology might have been reflected over the 100 years. And what I mean by that, this may be a bit simplistic, but if we understand Christology could be a high Christology with Jesus being more supernatural than human, and a low Christology being more human than supernatural, I'm sure there were people writing in 1925 with the high Christology, and there's people writing in 2020 with the high Christology. But I wondered if you just wanted to comment whether there was any flow up and down and what that might have looked like. I'll tell you my worry that most Canadians haven't darkened a church door in 20 years, a couple generations, and Christianity is experienced mostly online, where we hear a very high Christology. So I was just curious what the experience was over the last 100 years in the sermons you read.
Well, I don't think the terms high and low Christology are particularly useful for looking at Christology in the United Church. Right at the bat, in the basis of union, there's an affirmation of what they call the traditional creeds, presumably meaning Nicaea and Chalcedon. But there's a caveat that they feel the humanity of Jesus has been lost. That's always been important in the United Church Christology, right from the word go. So there is, when you read Salem Bland, who was preaching as a Methodist, it's a very human Jesus who goes before us, who goes outside the camp. There's a constant stress on the humanity of Jesus. What I see changing is the way Jesus is read from different contexts. For instance, in Susan Beaver's sermon preached at a Mohawk reserve near Brentford in the decade 2010 to 2020, Jesus is a member of the family. And at a big family meal, there's always a serving of meat, potatoes, and vegetables left, just in case he drops in and needs something to eat. So it's a very relational, but it's never a simply human Jesus. There's always a transcendent, and Beaver uses the ancient principle of exchange to help articulate Jesus' saving significance. So there are shifts. It's a more it's difficult to say. I'm tempted to say it's a more countercultural Jesus late after the 60s, but Salem Bland's Jesus was pretty countercultural in around 1912. So there are change. I think it's fair to say that once we get into the 70s and on, it's not a supersessionist Jesus. That's there earlier, but that tends to fade away after that. But there's almost always an interest in what Jesus was doing, where he was going, what he was saying. And that's not neglected in a sermon like by Nora Hughes, which is, on Galatians 5:1, I believe it is. It's very Pauline. But there is always this a focus on the humanity of Jesus, but never a reduction of Jesus to that. The other thing that's very important, particularly after the 60s, is what Augustine called the totus Christus, that the whole Christ is the head and the body, Jesus being the head and the church as the body. And that comes out in Anne Squire's sermon and a number of others, that there's this very, Jesus is the Christ, but it's not Jesus alone. That the body's got to be there, and the body's got to live it out and make it present. And that's in Catherine's sermon as we relate to each other. So there's a greater emphasis on that, I believe, in post-60s. So I'll leave it at that.
So we have a question online. The question is from Ian Villegas, who's an alum of ours. Ian asks, was there a sermon or insight that you found particularly surprising, or where you learned something unexpected?
I want to say about the one in French. So we have one, actually it's a little three like homily, almost like 5 minutes or less. But it's in French and it's in the 30s. What I loved about that, which I didn't realize how reformed I am, that their sermons is actually recorded as a radio. So almost like you're listening to the radio as a preacher's talking about. And it was a Christmas, and it was very much like this atmosphere, you know, dark, and there's a light glistening and so on. But the things that I was loving and very unexpected, and realize how I am so reformed, is that how the homily is very sacramental. You almost feel like a worshiping. You almost feel like, is it prayer, or is it actually message, or is it in the intersection there? Even very small, and it's very also Christological sense, right? They're, you know, very small, but has like 10 times of name Jesus in there, which I shouldn't be surprised, but I was. So that's one of those. The other piece is some of the sermons are so bold. And I want to say, I don't know, what I want to hear yours, but some of those sermons are so politically charged, and the language is blunt. Like Cliff Elliott sermon, it was right after the Richard Nixon's, what is the scandal? Watergate. Let's not forget the Watergate. That's the title of the sermon. And wow, I don't know how many UCC preachers today will talk about what happened in the US last week in such a bold, blunt way. I don't know. So that was, I shouldn't be surprised as a prophetic tradition of the UCC preaching tradition, but I was equally surprised. Yeah, is that good? Okay.
From what we have heard, the sermons are both important and varied. But as we all know, we come from a huge country, a large church. So I would be interested in your process of selection.
I don't really know how to describe it. You know, when Haran first said, we should do this book together, I said, that's a great idea, but I'm really busy, so I can't do it. and then next thing you know, I'm sending her a sermon by Lois Wilson and saying, hey, this would be really good for that book. And then here's one by Salem Bland. It's got to go in there. And you know, then I was in, you know, and it was a complex process. We had to balance kind of geography. We had to balance ethnic, racial diversity, all these different things. and we had to move through. There were some fairly obvious choices, like Chown's sermon, a very important historical statement, and Samuel Rose's sermon preached at the inaugural sermon of the United Church. I thought this needs to go in there. This is what was said to the church. This is who we are, what we're doing. Then I read every extant sermon by Cliff Elliott that he preached through the 70s. And I never found the one I was looking for. But the one that's in there is a blockbuster. And there were, Lewis Murray's sermon in the 50s almost didn't make it in. It came down to that sermon and another by another Maritimer, and I couldn't choose. So I sent them both to Ron McConnell. And I said, I really like this one. And he said, no, it's Murray's. And I said, yeah, but this one's really neat. And he said, it's Murray's. So Murray it was. And later, when it came to working on it, I really developed a very much deeper appreciation of that sermon. Someone said there was a question about surprises. At the late 80s and in the 90s, we all talked about globalization. This was a big deal, globalization. Murray preached that sermon in the 50s. And the key insights of globalization theory are right there in 2 paragraphs. The term isn't, but the idea and the insights and the sense of responsibility is. So it was a kind of mix and match, and also we knew we couldn't go on forever, so 2 or 3 per decade. And it was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle or something with way too many pieces. So that's how it went, I guess, in a nutshell.
So as I said in my remarks, it's incomplete because there are a lot more we could have included. Would have been 1,000 pages or more, and also. As a feminist, the gender justice issue is so big for me. It was really painful not being able to find much until. So when we found Rose, we were like, wow, we gotta have that in 40s, right? So that's that. So there is that limitation of that time. There's just, even if the ordination happened 36, very little sermons that we could have found preached by women. Things like that, right? And so non-Anglo preachers and their sermons that we wanted to capture, that was challenging, right? And I know we don't have everybody there for sure, right? And so there's that. Geographical location, and as Nancy, I think your question, is pointing to, we don't want to sort of glorify big mega churches who are so established with so many privileges, right? We want to capture the small church, rural ministry that are very important as well. So how do we capture those? We definitely don't want to be Toronto centered. And how do we move that? We definitely have to have some of those remarkable moderators' speech and preaching, but we shouldn't have all that. It would be so much easier if we just do that, right? Because everything is recorded. So finding those hidden treasures that are inaccessible to the archives, already that's very official, and already there is a power laden, right? And so it's our real deep hope that next book will come out with more hidden treasures of the preachers that did their faithful work will come to the fore for us to access. But so in that regard, it's far from being complete. I know that we have some food waiting. So, oh, one more?
We have to take Anne's question.
We'll take one more.
Yeah, then my.
If there's someone else that would like to. Oh. I was just curious because it sounds like from Professor Shu as well that there's some interest in maybe seeing this happen for other like faith and other spiritualities and other practices. If you had any, or maybe if you could go back 6 years in time, and if there was one note of advice or tip that you would give yourself or to someone who would like to pursue a project like this, what would that be?
So Hannah did the translation from French to English. That's why it was noted. What a great question. I'm totally biased, but yeah, I think that the interreligious or something. I mean, the sermon from the interment that John you so beautifully captured. When I read that sermon, that's done by a Japanese preacher, I almost read like, is this kind of Buddhist Dharma teaching happening at the same time? As well as, and in terms of the unpacking some of the words in that Japanese language and kind of cultural wisdom beyond the Christian gospel. And so I think that would be one key that at least we know in Buddhist tradition, there's that teaching. I don't know, will they call homily or sermon? Probably not, but there is that teaching. The other, in the Muslim communities, right, Imam, and there is also teaching of sharing the reflection of what the so-called Quran says, or the Muhammad or Prophet. So I think that would be very similar. But things that I would love exploring is some of these things. So when we hear the teaching from Buddhist community, often is on the floor and teachers actually sitting and everybody is sitting. So how does that body, the physical posture, influence or shapes the very understanding of the teaching? So similarly, in the Muslim communities, as much as important to learn about Quran, their daily prayer, right? And their prayer, not just thinking about it, but they actually go all the way down to the ground, right? The mat. That's how their faithful life starts. So how those kind of physical, bodily, communal, relational, experiential aspects will shape and enhance preaching practice. That would be a really good thing and something that maybe Christian communities should learn more from, maybe. Yeah.
Well, if I'm allowed to share things from the Buddhist perspective, as you mentioned that, the Buddhist sermons, from what I experienced, are usually not very meticulously crafted, like the sermons that I'm reading from this book. They are more spontaneous and improvised, and usually not documented. So this is something, on the other hand, that I think the Buddhist tradition should learn from this book. Yeah. Yeah. So, and are there any more questions? If not, there is food waiting for us outside, and I really appreciate everyone's joining us today, and especially thank you all for having me serving you as the moderator this evening. And let me also say that if there is a second book And if the sermon was originally written in Chinese, it would be my privilege to translate that for you. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
So many of you know that there are books at the back for sale. So if you didn't pick up a copy, I'm sure you probably are itching to pick up one now. And there is a discount available for you fine people here tonight. And also I share that discount online with our online participants. Thank you so much for joining us. So grab your books, get them signed. You have your pens, right? Get them signed, and then join us down the hall. Just walk to the other end, just before the library on the left-hand side in the formal lounge. We have lots of goodies, so please join us there for some great conversation, food, and nourishment. Thank you for joining us tonight.
I should sign them.
Yes.
You're welcome. It was so good to be here. Get my text out of your way.
Yeah,